"Get out of the car! Put your hands up! Don't make me say it again!" A powerful shout rang out in the quiet night, breaking the silence of the deserted Georgia road. Two red and blue lights flashed continuously, illuminating the black SUV that had just been forced to stop on the side of the road. The man in the car slowly put his hands on the steering wheel, his face calm but his eyes showing a hint of annoyance. He had done nothing wrong. He had not sped, had not run a red light, had not broken any laws. But the two policemen standing outside did not care about that. "I told you to get out of the car right now." Profanity followed without hesitation. One of the officers had a gun in his hand, his eyes menacing. They thought this was easy prey, a lone black man in the middle of the night. Little did they know, with just one call from him, their careers could end tonight. Little did they know that the man they had just insulted was not an ordinary person, and they had no idea that in just a few minutes, their lives would change forever. What happened? Let's get into today's story. The black SUV glided smoothly down the deserted streets of a small Georgia town. It was late at night, and the yellow streetlights cast a patchy glow across the asphalt. The roar of the car's engine was almost the only sound in the quiet night. David sat behind the wheel, his right hand resting lightly on the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the front. His face exuded calmness. The wrinkles at the corners of his eyes and forehead deepened over the years, showing the experience of a man who had gone through too many storms. At 52 years old, his physique was still strong, and the resolute demeanor of a man who had commanded thousands of soldiers had not faded. He had just returned from a long trip to the Pentagon. It was an important meeting where he and senior officials discussed upcoming military strategies. The work was stressful, but he was used to it. What he was looking forward to now was not the meetings, but the return home, the rest, the time away from the thick reports and strategic decisions. David sighed, glancing in the rearview mirror. For a split second, a red light flashed, blinking. A police car appeared behind him, its red and blue lights reflecting off the windows of his SUV. He frowned. This wasn't the first time he'd been pulled over while driving alone at night, a reality all too familiar to black men like him. The siren blared, signaling him to pull over. David didn't react immediately. He took a deep breath and calmed himself. He knew he hadn't broken any laws. His car was legal, his papers were in order. He hadn't been speeding or breaking any traffic laws. But he also knew that didn't matter. Sometimes, for some police officers, the mere fact that he was a black man driving an expensive car was enough of a reason to stop him. He turned on his signal and slowly pulled over to the side of the road. Looking out the window, he saw two police officers getting out of their patrol car. Both were white, in neat uniforms, one short and stocky with a crew cut, the other taller, with a sharp face and cold eyes. David kept both hands on the wheel, his eyes unwavering. He had taught his men that when stopped by the police, the most important thing was to stay calm and not do anything that would give them an excuse to escalate. And now, he had to do it himself. The short, stocky policeman walked up to his car window and knocked loudly on the glass. David rolled down the window. A cold night breeze blew into the car, carrying the smell of tar and fog. "Vehicle registration," the policeman ordered, his tone devoid of any respect. David looked him straight in the eye. "May I know why I was stopped?" he asked, his voice low and calm. The cop smirked. "You didn't signal when you changed lanes. Now give me your papers." David felt his blood boil. What a blatant lie. He knew he had followed the traffic laws perfectly, but he also knew that arguing at this point would only make the situation worse. He slowly reached for his driver's license and car registration from the glove compartment and handed them to the police officer. He snatched the paper and glanced at it casually. His eyes skimmed the name on the license, David Carter, but he clearly didn't recognize anything special. The other policeman, the taller one, moved closer. He crossed his arms over his chest and looked at David with contempt. "Where are you from?" David glanced at him. "I'm on my way home." The policeman snorted, then suddenly bent down to look inside the car. "Is this your car?" "That's right." "I'm sure you didn't steal it?" His voice was full of sarcasm. David clenched his jaw. A simmering anger rose in his chest, but he held it in. He was used to situations like this. A black man in an expensive SUV? To some cops, that meant crime. The short, stocky policeman sneered. "Get out of the car!" David didn't move. "Do I have a right to know why?" The cop leaned in, close to the car door. His breath smelled of coffee and tobacco. "Because I said so, nigger." The air suddenly froze. David's anger flared more strongly, but he kept it under control. He looked the policeman straight in the eye. "What does that mean?" The taller cop laughed. "What he meant was, you should do as you're told. Don't make things difficult." David exhaled slowly. He felt his fingers tighten on the steering wheel. He had served in the military for more than 30 years, fought in real wars, faced dangerous enemies. But he had never felt so humiliated as he did now, in the country he had devoted his life to defending. The short, stocky policeman drew his gun. Click! There was a terrifying sound as he cocked the gun. David looked down at the black barrel of the gun pointed straight at him. "Get out of the car, now!" David didn't move. His eyes never left the officer pointing his gun at him. In his 30 years in the military, he had seen more guns than he could remember. But he had never imagined that one would be aimed at his own head on American soil, simply because of the color of his skin. He raised his hands slowly, not out of fear, but because he knew the men before him were looking for an excuse. One wrong move, one move that might make them feel threatened, and they would not hesitate to pull the trigger. And then his death would be a familiar story on the news. Black man shot dead by police for refusing to obey. "Get out of the car, now!" roared the short, stocky cop, Patrick Wilson. David looked at him for a moment, then slowly opened the car door. He stepped out, his hands still raised, his gaze calm but firm. The chill of the night seeped through his thin shirt, but David didn't notice. What he did notice was the way the two policemen were looking at him, not as a man, but as a cornered criminal. Chris Miller, the taller cop, stepped closer, looking him up and down with contempt. "Look at that, a black guy driving a fancy car," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You must have gotten it from welfare fraud, huh?" David did not reply. He knew the words were a trap meant to make him lose control. Miller chuckled, then suddenly pushed David's shoulder. "Talk? Or do you know I'm right?" David staggered a bit, but quickly regained his balance. "Don't touch me," he said, his voice low but authoritative. Wilson stepped forward, still clutching the gun. "You dare give orders to the police?" he sneered. "Who do you think you are?" David held his gaze. "I think I am a citizen who has the right to be treated fairly." "Fair?" Miller laughed. "Listen, Wilson, he talks about fairness." Wilson laughed along. "Fair to who? You guys?" David clenched his jaw, but he didn't let his emotions get the better of him. He had faced far more dangerous enemies than these two. But his anger wasn't just directed at the two cops before him. It was directed at the system that allowed people like them to exist, that allowed them to abuse their power, that allowed them to think they had the right to control the lives of people like him simply because of the color of their skin. Wilson took a step forward, tapping the barrel of the gun against David's chest. "Get down on your knees." David didn't move. "No." The smile on Wilson's face vanished. "I said get down." David stood still. He looked straight into his eyes, unafraid, unwavering. "Are not." Miller immediately stepped forward, grabbed David's shoulders and tried to force him down. But even though he was over 50 years old, David was still a strong man. He did not budge. "Get down on the ground," Wilson roared, his patience now gone. David looked him straight in the eye. Why? Wilson gritted his teeth. Because I said so. That is not a legitimate reason. David's words were like a slap to Wilson's face. For a moment, his face was twisted with anger. Then, he raised the gun high and brought the butt of the gun down on the back of David's head. The blow knocked David off balance. His head throbbed, but he did not fall. He staggered a little, but immediately regained his footing. Miller whistled. Stubborn, but he will eventually kneel. Wilson roared, this time using both hands to push David down. Losing his balance, David was forced to fall to one knee. There you go, said Miller, clapping his hands as if he were enjoying the show. Finally, I know who I am. David looked up at them, his eyes not containing the submission they expected. Wilson cursed, then suddenly kicked David hard in the back, sending him falling face down to the ground. His face hit the cold pavement. He felt the small pebbles scrape against his skin, but he showed no pain. Miller leaned down and whispered in his ear. Welcome to reality, nigger. Wilson laughed. Maybe he thinks he's important. Miller laughed. Maybe. Look at the way he looks. I bet he wants to pretend to be some big shot. Maybe even a successful businessman. Wilson nodded. Let's see what this big guy has. He stood up, walked to David's car, opened the door, and began searching. David turned his head, saw the scene, and for the first time since he was stopped, real anger rose in his heart. You have no orders. His voice was authoritative. Wilson ignored him, continued rummaging through the glove compartment, then deliberately threw all his papers into the back seat. David clenched his fists, but he still didn't overreact. Miller looked down at him. Well, big brother, do you feel small now? David looked at him, his eyes colder than the night around him. You are breaking the law, he said, his voice low but firm. Wilson chuckled. Oh, are we breaking the law? He stepped closer, hands on hips. Who are you to teach the law to the police? David looked him straight in the eye. I am a federal employee. The smiles on Wilson and Miller's faces vanished. For a few seconds, a silence fell. Wilson narrowed his eyes. Federal employee? Don't lie. David did not answer. He just looked at them, calm but defiant. It was that calmness that made Wilson uneasy. He glanced at Miller, then back at David. We have a tough guy here, Miller said, his voice no longer contemptuous, but a little wary. David sat up straight, ignoring the dull ache in the back of his head from Officer Wilson's blow. The patrol car's flashing lights cast red and blue flashes across his face, but his eyes were as steady as a seasoned warrior's. Miller and Wilson stood there, watching him as if trying to guess what this stubborn black man would do next. They still thought they were in control. David slowly brushed the dust off his shirt, then looked up at the two policemen. I want to make a phone call, he said, his voice calm but authoritative. Wilson crossed his arms and sneered. Call? For what? Call a lawyer? I'm telling you, your lawyer can't do anything. Miller chuckled. Yeah, give it a try. We like watching you waste your time. They thought David was just an ordinary black citizen, maybe a small businessman or someone with money but no power. They had no idea that the man sitting in front of them could easily change their destiny with just one phone call. David didn't argue. He just reached into his shirt pocket and slowly pulled out his phone. Wilson immediately put his hand on the gun stock. Be careful. Don't get into any trouble, he warned. David kept his eyes calm. I just took the phone. Miller glanced at Wilson, then shrugged. Fine. Let him call, but make it quick. David dialed a number he had memorized for decades. The line rang only once before someone picked up. This is General Robert Anderson, a deep voice said. No longer as cold as when facing the police, David's voice was softer now, but still firm. Hello, General Anderson. I am Colonel David Carter. There was a moment of silence. Then the voice on the other end rang out, now with a hint of surprise and concern. David? What's wrong? David glanced at the two policemen who were still laughing, unaware that they had just stepped 1 foot into the abyss. I am currently being stopped by 2 local police officers without any justification, he said, each word clear and sharp. They insulted me, used unlawful force, and searched my car without a warrant. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. Then General Anderson's voice turned cold. Their names? David looked up at the 2 policemen, still not realizing who he was talking to. I'll send it to you. He quickly snapped a photo of Wilson and Miller standing next to his car and sent it to General Anderson in a flash. Miller frowned slightly when he saw David do that. Who are you calling? David curled his lips, his eyes as sharp as knives. The one who can end your careers tonight. His words made Wilson frown. Are you kidding? But before David could reply, Wilson's shoulder-mounted radio suddenly rang out, breaking the 2 policemen's arrogant atmosphere. Beep, beep! Wilson, Miller, you have someone you shouldn't be holding. Release him immediately. That's an order. For the first time all evening, the smug smiles disappeared from Wilson and Miller's faces. The 2 policemen exchanged puzzled glances, as if they couldn't believe what they had just heard. David remained on the ground, but this time, he was in complete control. He studied the 2 men before him, their expressions now like those of men who had just realized they had walked into a deadly trap. Wilson swallowed, regained his composure, and tried to sound professional. Who did you call? David did not answer at once. He stood up slowly, brushing the dust off his clothes again. Then, without haste, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, dark blue card with a gold border. Military ID card. He held it up in front of Wilson and Miller so they could read the words printed on it. Colonel David Carter, United States Army, Pentagon. No further explanation needed. Miller blinked repeatedly, his face as white as a sheet of paper. Wilson, who had been so arrogant as to order David to his knees just a few minutes ago, was now stuttering and unable to form words. This is... Miller tried to speak, but his voice was so weak that even he didn't recognize it. Wilson cleared his throat, trying to keep his composure. We, had a bit of a misunderstanding here. Misunderstanding? David repeated, his eyes cold. Wilson swallowed. Yes, you know, we don't know who you are. You don't know who I am. David repeated himself slowly, word for word, like a sentence being read. So if I wasn't an army colonel, if I was just a regular black man, what would happen? No one answered. David took a step forward, causing Wilson and Miller to reflexively step back. The change in power position happened too quickly for them to adapt. Let me tell you something, David continued, his voice low but firm. If I weren't an army colonel, you would have arrested me for nothing. You would have pushed me to the ground, shoved me into a patrol car, taken me to the station, and fabricated a false charge to cover up your crimes. And worse, I would have become another victim of abuse of power. Wilson shook his head quickly. No, it's not like that, Colonel. We were just doing our duty. We didn't mean to. No offense? David gave a cold smile. What did you guys call me earlier? Nigger? Welfare cheater? Is that no offense? Miller looked down at the ground, clearly unable to find any reasonable excuse. David looked at them, his eyes no longer filled with mere personal anger. It was frustration, with the weariness of seeing the same story over and over again. This isn't the first time something like this has happened. Not to me, but to thousands of others. His voice rang out in the night, strong and sharp as a knife. Black people are stopped by the police for no reason, insulted, humiliated, threatened. And not everyone can call a general to save them like I just did. His words left Wilson and Miller speechless. They had no way to deny it. The air was thick, so heavy it could cut. But before anyone could say anything more, another sound rang out in the night. Siren. Another police car was speeding towards the scene, but this time, It was no ordinary patrol car. It is the internal investigation team's car. Miller and Wilson turned pale. David stood there, eyes fixed on them. He knew things had gone too far for them to hide from the consequences, and this time, there was no going back. The Internal Affairs squad car pulled up behind Wilson and Miller's patrol car. The door swung open, and two officers stepped out, followed by a middle-aged man with an air of authority. On his chest, a badge spelled out his title, Chief Raymond Harper. As soon as they saw their superiors appear, Wilson and Miller stood up straight reflexively, but they couldn't hide the panic on their faces. Harper scanned the scene, his sharp gaze stopping on David Carter. His eyes narrowed when he saw the military ID card David still held in his hand. He turned to Wilson and Miller, his voice low but powerful. "Do you two know what you just did?" Wilson swallowed, trying to regain his professional composure. "Sir, it was just a little misunderstanding. We don't know who he is." "It doesn't matter who he is," Harper interrupted, his voice hard. "It matters what you two did." He turned to the Internal Affairs officer, signaling with his eyes. The man nodded, took a small device from his belt, and pressed a button. A recording began to play, the voice ringing out clearly in the middle of the night. Voices of Wilson and Miller. "Get out of the car, nigger! I don't need a reason to arrest someone like you. I swear, if you open your mouth to argue, this bullet will be the last thing you see." The more he listened, the more Chief Harper's face fell. When the recording ended, he turned to his two deputies. "Are you crazy?" Wilson and Miller paled. "Sir, we just—" "Shut up," Harper growled. "Your body cameras recorded everything. Everything. Don't try to defend yourself." Wilson and Miller were speechless. They understood that it was all over. Harper turned back to David, his expression serious but a little guilty. "Colonel Carter, on behalf of the police department, I apologize for this incident." David nodded, but his eyes were unforgiving. "Sorry is not enough, Chief. I want to make sure these two officers never have the opportunity to abuse their power again." Harper looked straight at him, then turned back to his two subordinates. "Wilson Miller, from this moment on, you are suspended immediately." Wilson took a deep breath, seemingly in disbelief. "Chief, please listen to us. There is nothing to hear," Harper roared. "Not only are you abusing your power, but you are also blatantly racist. You have no place on this force." Miller nearly collapsed, while Wilson clutched his police cap, his hands shaking. They had just gone from being the most powerful people in the situation to being the most pitiful losers. But the punishment did not stop there. David looked straight at Harper, his voice calm but authoritative. "I want a formal investigation. This isn't just about these two people. It's about the system. If these two officers can act like this without worrying about the consequences, then I don't believe they're isolated." Harper was silent for a few seconds. Then he sighed and nodded. "I understand, Colonel. We will conduct a full investigation." The investigation began that same week. Audio and video recordings from Wilson and Miller's body cameras became irrefutable evidence. Not only did the officers make racist remarks, but they also abused their power and threatened the life of an innocent citizen without just cause. Initially, the police union tried to defend them, but under public pressure, they quickly backed down. Wilson and Miller were officially fired. The news not only shocked the local community, but also attracted federal attention. A wider investigation was launched to see how many similar cases had been hidden within the town's police force. Many black people bravely came forward to report being stopped, insulted, and threatened, like David Carter. Public anger reached a boiling point when these stories flooded the media. Chief Harper, though initially trying to stay calm, could not avoid the pressure. To calm public opinion, he pledged to completely reform the police department, changing the hiring and training process to prevent racists from entering the ranks. As for David, he was not happy with this result. After the investigation was over, he received invitations from human rights organizations and the media to tell his story. But he did not want to be the center of attention. He only wanted one thing: justice must be served not only in this case, but for all black people who had suffered injustice like him. Late one afternoon, as the Georgia sky turned red with dusk, David drove down the same road where he had been stopped that day. But this time, he was no longer a victim with a gun to his head. He is a man who has won. He proved that no one has the right to abuse power to trample on others. And for those who once thought they could act with impunity, this will be a lesson never to be forgotten. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story. If you like this content, please click like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next meaningful stories, because tomorrow we will have another meaningful story for you.